Okay, so welcome to the next module on inflammation. And basically this entire module is going to be spent on inflammation, which will then be a starting point to also talk about the immune system. Because there's a lot of overlap between inflammation and the immune system. Okay, so inflammation is basically the body's biological response to some kind of a harmful stimulus, such as an infection, maybe a bacteria or a virus that's invading the body, a response to damaged or injured cells, or irritation to the cells. Okay, and it's very protective. Okay, so the inflammatory response is the body's response to protect itself from injury, infection, and irritants, and also to heal the body. Okay, and it's a mixture of cells that are going to be part of inflammation, blood vessels that bring fluid and cells to the area, plus also what are called molecular mediators that we'll talk about that are heavily involved in inflammation. And it's really to eliminate the initial cause of the inflammation, such as a bacteria or a virus, to clear out the injured or dead tissue, and then heal the tissue that's been injured. Okay, so let's go on and start with inflammation. Okay, so we're going to talk about lines of defense in the immune system. And the reason why we're starting this way is because the inflammatory response is going to be part of one of the lines of defense. Okay, so let's just break up the immune system into two parts. The innate immunity, which is really non-specific defenses, and you'll see inflammation is in there, and the adaptive immunity, which is the immunity that is very specific to a particular infection. And we'll talk about that part in a minute. So the first line of defense in the innate immunity is the barriers of the body. So the skin, the mucous membranes, such as in your mouth, in your gastrointestinal tract, they're all lines of defense, right? And there's secretions from the skin, there's secretions from your saliva in your mouth. In fact, saliva has antibodies within it to attack foreign invaders. Okay, so these are just general protective mechanisms that are always in place for the body. The second line of defense consists of a few cells, so phagocytic leukocytes. Leukocytes is just a term for white blood cells. And there's some white blood cells, in particular macrophages, that are phagocytic, meaning they have the ability to surround a foreign protein or a foreign bacteria or virus, surround it, engulf it, and bring it into the cell, into the macrophage, and destroy it. Okay, so there's some cells in the innate immune system that we'll talk about. There's antimicrobial proteins that are secreted as part of the innate immune system. And what do? Well, some of them will attach themselves to the foreign invaders. Some of the proteins will send signals to other parts of the immune system to warn the immune system that there's an invader, so that you need to come and help fight this invader. Okay, so there's a number of different proteins that we'll talk about, and they're typically part of the innate immune system to activate other parts of the immune system. The inflammatory response. which is the response that we're going to spend a lot of time on, which is part of the innate immune system. It's non-specific, meaning it's going to react the same way every time something invades the body. It has no memory of the invader. It'll just behave the same way, whether it's a splinter, a bacteria, a virus, or whatever's trying to enter the body. And it'll set up an inflammatory response, which typically consists of swelling, redness, heat, a number of responses that we're going to go into. Fever is a non-specific part of the innate immune system. So there's certain chemicals that are released during the inflammatory response as part of the innate immunity that can give patients a fever. Okay, so fever can be from inflammation, or fever can be from, say, for example, an infection. The adaptive immunity, or the specific defense, is to a particular type of infection. So you might have adaptive immunity to tetanus, or to measles, or to rabies, if you had the rabies shots. Or say you had chickenpox as a child. Now you have an adaptive immunity so that you're not going to get chickenpox again. Okay? And this typically consists of lymphocytes, which is another type of white blood cell. Okay, so there's 5 types of white blood cells we're going to discuss. And white blood cells in general are called leukocytes. So if we look at that second line of defense, you'll notice that we did talk about one type of white blood cell called phagocytic leukocytes, and those are called macrophages. Okay, they can engulf cells, engulf antigens or bacteria and destroy them. Lymphocytes are just another type of white blood cell, and they're broken into 2 types: B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. B lymphocytes have the ability to produce antibodies to a specific antigen or infection that's coming into the body. It can take a week or 2 weeks, but once the antibodies are produced from B cells, they're very effective at destroying the invader. Okay, and those B cells remain and maintain a memory of that particular invader, so that next time it sees it again, it can easily generate antibodies and destroy that specific invader. Okay. The other lymphocyte are the T lymphocytes, and the T lymphocytes are broken down into T helper cells, and another name for them are CD4 cells, and they coordinate the attack between the B cells and the T cells, and we'll come to that. And the other type of T cell is a cytotoxic T cells. They can directly approach the invading bacteria, virus, or antigen and directly destroy it. Okay? And this system forms memory cells. So memory lymphocytes, whether they're B cells or T cells, they form a long-term memory so that the body can immediately respond the next time it sees the identical infection. Okay, so let's slowly go through this so it makes some sense, right? Because you can easily get mixed up with cells and blood vessels and tissue, and so we're just going to go through it, and we're going to talk about the lines of defense, which cells do what, so it really makes sense. Okay, so the first line of defense is just restricting entry, right? And we spoke about that. The natural barriers such as the skin, the mucous membranes, biochemical barriers such as sweat, tears, mucus, saliva that can continually flush away the foreign antigens. And when I say antigen, I mean, and I say foreign antigen, it means really anything that's foreign to the body. Okay, so that could include molecules that don't belong in the body, or antigens that are attached to bacteria or virus that the body recognizes as foreign. Okay, and remember, mucus, such as or saliva in the mouth, contains antibodies. So really, biochemical barriers are not only to wash away and to keep things flowing through the gastrointestinal tract or to clear them off the skin. Saliva also has some antibodies within it. Okay, second line of defense, still the innate immune system. So you can just see the slide above, and this one is part of the innate immune system. Well, now there's some cells that are living in the tissue. Okay, so for example, you cut yourself and bacteria get in. Well, there's phagocytic cells, and they are made up of macrophages, which are a type of white blood cells, and neutrophils, which are another type of white blood cell. And they respond very quickly to a potential entry of a foreign invader. Okay, now as part of that cellular response there, you can have proteins that are secreted by these cells. So cytokines, such as interleukins and interferons, they come from cells of the immune system, such as neutrophils and macrophages, and another one that we'll talk about called a mast cell, and they act as communication with other parts of the immune system to request help, to bring in other types of cells. Okay. Histamine is another chemical that's secreted by cells, and histamine causes vasodilation. So it dilates the blood vessels, the little capillaries at the injury site, and it allows fluid and cells to come into the area to help out. There's also other chemicals such as prostaglandins and leukotrienes, and they are chemicals that also ramp up the immune system. Prostaglandins, in fact, once they get into the bloodstream, are responsible for going to the brain and leading to a fever. Okay, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so we have phagocytic leukocytes hanging around all the tissues, waiting for a potential invader. We have proteins that they can secrete to communicate with other cells and to cause vasodilation of the blood vessels, and the general inflammatory response, which is partly what we just spoke about. And we'll talk about the general inflammatory response. Okay, and there's 3 stages of inflammation. So there's increased blood flow and vascular permeability to an area. So let's keep with that wound that we have. So there's a wound on your arm because you cut yourself by accident, and there's bacteria into the wound. Okay, some of the cells are going to release histamine. Histamine causes vasodilation, which is going to increase blood flow to the area. There's going to be a cellular response. Okay, so there's increased blood flow, there's a cellular response, and when we say cellular chemotaxis, it means that there's cells that are now going to be attracted to the area to help out. And then lastly, there's going to be a systemic response. So an entire body response. And that's typically where we're going to talk about fever. Okay? So think of those 3 stages, because we're going to go through those 3 stages of inflammation. And remember, inflammation is part of the innate immune system. So whether it's fighting a bacteria or fighting just a foreign substance, such as dirt in a wound, it is there to clear the foreign objects, to increase blood flow, to bring in cells, and potentially to have a systemic response. Okay, so let's just continue to talk about some chemical mediators or inflammatory mediators that can be released by cells to communicate with other cells or to generate the inflammatory response. So when we're thinking of this wound we have on our arm, okay, the 3 main cells that come pretty quickly are mast cells, macrophages that are already there, and neutrophils that come out of the bloodstream within a few hours. Okay, so the process is mast cells release histamine that cause vasodilation of the blood vessels, those little capillaries in the area. They allow vasodilation and fluid to leak out of the blood vessels, and this will also allow cells to leak out of the blood vessels, such as neutrophils. Okay? Cytokines are just chemicals that communicate between different parts of the immune system. So interleukins, interferons, tumor necrosis factor, those are just communicating molecules between white blood cells and other cells that are involved in the inflammatory response and the immune response. Leukotrienes, again, just another chemical that can ramp up the inflammatory response. Tumor necrosis factor, I mentioned, cells can release this factor to help in attacking, say, a tumor or in general inflammation. Prostaglandins are released. Prostaglandins go into the bloodstream and they can go to the brain and stimulate a fever. Okay? Platelet activating factors. So cells can release platelet activating factor that tell the platelets, come and help out. I've been cut here. I'm bleeding. I need you to come and stop the bleeding. Okay, so all of these are just chemicals that activate the inflammatory response. They'll make more sense as we go through this module. Okay, so we're talking about inflammation here. Inflammation is a part of the innate immune system. So let's talk about some cells in the inflammatory process. So you have white blood cells, and in the innate immune system, where inflammation first starts, you typically have neutrophils that come to the area within hours. You have cells that are also white blood cells called monocytes in the bloodstream, but once they leave the bloodstream and are in the tissue, they're now called macrophages. Okay. There's also lymphocytes, which are part of the adaptive immune system. We're not going to talk about those right now. And eosinophils and basophils. Those are other white blood cells. So in actual fact, you're seeing all the white blood cells there. But the part of the innate immune system cells, neutrophils, monocytes, and we're going to talk about mast cells. Okay. Endothelial cells are just the inner lining of the blood vessel, right? And they can be affected by chemicals such as histamine. And histamine can cause the blood vessels to dilate and become more permeable, so more leaky, allowing fluid and cells to enter the area that's been injured. Okay. There's also platelets in the bloodstream, and platelets are the initial cells that form a clot to stop the bleeding. Okay, so they're part of the inflammatory response too, because they form the initial what's called platelet plug to stop bleeding at the site if there is bleeding. Okay, what about the cells that are already in the tissue? So we spoke about cells that can come to the area, and in the innate immune system, that's neutrophils and monocytes turn into macrophages. What about cells that are already there in the tissue? Well, you have your mast cells, which release the histamine to activate the inflammation. You have fibroblasts that live in the soft tissue, and they're healing cells, so they'll come in a bit later, and they'll produce new collagen that leads to healing of the area. And you already have macrophages there. Okay, macrophages are all over the place, just waiting for something to enter the body. So you have macrophages in your skin, you have macrophages in your brain, in your liver, in your spleen, all over the place. Okay, in your lungs, and they're just waiting for something to attack the body. Okay, so we'll go on and we'll get a bit more detailed about inflammation and how it all fits together. Okay, so the third line of defense that we're not going to spend too much time on right now is the adaptive immune system, right? So we spoke about the innate immune system and how it responds with its natural barriers and certain cells that will respond within minutes to hours. The adaptive immune system consists of B and T lymphocytes, and they take time to identify the antigen or the infection and produce a specific response to it. But once the response is produced, it's typically very powerful. Okay? So the main cells we're going to talk about in the adaptive immune system are B and T lymphocytes. Okay, cytokines. So cytokines, you already know, are these communicating molecules so that the innate immune system can communicate with the adaptive immune system and say, listen, we've had entry into our body of this infection. Please help out by forming antibodies and specific cytotoxic T cells to come and destroy it. Okay? So they're just chemical communicators. So what are the characteristics of the adaptive immune system? Well, it's delayed. Okay, so if it's never seen the infection before or the antigen, it's going to take days to weeks to mount a specific response. The response, okay, I just said it anyways, is very specific to that particular invader. And a memory. So years later, if that same infection were to invade the body, the adaptive immune system would be ready and waiting because it has a memory from the initial response from years ago. Okay, so adaptive immune system creates a long-term memory.